When Keanu Reeves stepped onto the set of the Steve Harvey show, the audience buzzed with warm anticipation, expecting laughs, a Hollywood anecdote or two. But as he emerged into the light, the room shifted. This wasn't just another guest spot. The air grew softer, heavier, charged with something unspoken. Then Keanu's gaze caught the small crucifix on Steve's neck. In that moment, silence deepened, sacred, electric. His quiet humility stilled further, as if a buried weight had risen. "Steve," he said, voice steady yet fragile, "can I share something I've never said out loud?" The interview dissolved. Steve's smile faded into a knowing nod. The audience leaned in, sensing something beyond entertainment unfolding. The cameras rolled, but this wasn't about fame, it was about a raw, unscripted truth. Two men, one seeking peace, the other bearing a cross with a meaning only he'd known until now. Have you ever felt a presence greater than yourself slip into a moment, unexpected yet undeniable? Share your thoughts below. Type yes if you've known that quiet, life-changing stillness. Keanu sat in a kind of stillness that didn't feel rehearsed or posed. It was the stillness of someone who had lived through something and carried the echoes of it everywhere he went. His voice, when it came, was low, not hushed for effect, but tempered by the memory of real pain. There was no trace of celebrity in his tone. No polished anecdotes or carefully curated charm. What filled the room was something deeper, more human. He spoke not as a Hollywood figure, but as a man who had been wounded, who had searched for meaning in the quiet hours when no one else was watching, and who had come face to face with the kind of loneliness that doesn't need to be loud to consume you. He confessed something that very few in his position ever allow themselves to say. That fame, with all its glimmer and grandeur, often demands a performance so relentless, you forget who you are beneath the applause. People see the name, the headlines, the roles. But they rarely see the man who comes home to silence. The man who lies awake at night, trying to remember the sound of his own voice without a script attached to it. "People think I've got it all figured out," he said, his eyes downcast. "But most days, I'm just trying to make it to tomorrow. That's all." Then he spoke about a night, years ago, when everything felt like it had fallen apart. Sleep wouldn't come. Food had lost its meaning. Words got stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat. The silence in his room wasn't peaceful, it was deafening. He reached for his phone, not because he believed it would help, but because doing anything felt better than doing nothing. He scrolled aimlessly, not looking for inspiration, certainly not looking for God. And yet, grace doesn't always wait for an invitation. By chance, or what he now calls mercy, he came across a video. It was grainy, the audio uneven. There was no fancy backdrop, no booming crowd, just a man standing in what looked like a small, humble church. The lighting flickered. The camera tilted once or twice. But none of that mattered. Because the voice, the message cut through everything. It was Pastor Elijah, speaking with a rawness that bypassed all pretense. He wasn't preaching to impress. He wasn't selling hope like a product. He was speaking from his own cracks, his own bruises. Keanu leaned in as he described what he felt watching that clip, the way the words seemed to find him, even though he hadn't been searching for them. "That night," he said, his voice nearly a whisper, "I wasn't looking for God, but somehow, He found me anyway." The room held its breath. Not in suspense, but in sacred stillness. There was something so undeniably human in the way he said it, like a man remembering the exact moment he realized he hadn't been alone, even in his darkest hour. He spoke of how Pastor Elijah didn't try to numb pain or offer empty solutions. Instead, he honored it. He called it by name. He said that suffering wasn't something to be discarded, but something to be shaped into purpose. That perhaps our wounds are not signs of weakness, but the places where God tries to pour in light. That line, "God doesn't waste pain," stuck with Keanu in a way nothing else had. He admitted that he had heard thousands of voices throughout his life. Directors, critics, fans, interviewers. But none of them reached him the way this one simple, unpolished message did. It didn't matter that Elijah didn't know who was watching. What mattered was that he spoke the truth anyway. And in doing so, he gave Keanu the one thing he hadn't felt in weeks: permission to get up. To breathe. To try again. Not because everything was fixed, but because he realized he wasn't forgotten. It wasn't the quality of the video, Keanu said quietly, eyes distant, and it wasn't even the exact words. It was the fact that someone was brave enough to speak like that, honest, unguarded. And somehow, in the middle of all my noise, it made everything else go quiet. His voice cracked slightly, not from performance, but from memory. He looked up, then back at Pastor Elijah, who sat across from him no longer as a talk show host, but as a man who unknowingly reached into someone's darkest hour and gave him light. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to understand something unspoken: that healing doesn't always come through answers. Sometimes, it arrives through recognition. Through one soul whispering to another in the dark, "I see you. You're not alone." That night, Keanu realized something that would stay with him forever. He hadn't been saved by a sermon. He'd been saved by truth, spoken in faith, from one wounded heart to another. Keanu drew in a breath, the kind that doesn't just fill the lungs but comes from somewhere deeper, a place where memory and emotion live, where silence speaks louder than sound. His eyes never left Elijah's. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried the undeniable authority of someone who had walked through fire and lived to tell the story. What came from his mouth wasn't new. In fact, it was something Elijah himself had once spoken. But hearing it now, reflected back to him with such gravity, gave it a weight he never expected. For the first time, Pastor Elijah heard his own sermon spoken not from a pulpit, not from a script, but from a man who had once been on the edge, clutching those very words like a lifeline. Keanu recited them slowly, carefully, word for word, each syllable alive with meaning. They weren't just lines from a past message. They were sacred echoes, carried across time by a man who had needed them more than Elijah could have ever imagined. The shift in the room was almost tangible. It felt like a tide turning inward, like the walls themselves were listening. And for a moment, the roles dissolved. The one who had once offered comfort was now the one being reminded that it mattered. That he mattered. Keanu paused, his expression gentle but unflinching. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic gesture of thanks. Just a soft smile, the kind that comes from recognition, not of fame or talent, but of calling. "You're a shepherd," he said, voice low and full of quiet reverence. Not with a collar or a sermon series. Not in stained glass or church bulletins. But with your words. With your faith. You've been leading people without even knowing who's following. The words hung in the air like a hush, not asking to be answered, only received. Keanu continued, almost in a whisper now, "You're a shepherd in disguise. Not behind a pulpit but behind a microphone." Elijah blinked, visibly stunned. Not because he didn't believe it could be true, but because he had never dared to consider that his voice spoken from the trenches of his own struggle could have carried that far. His breath hitched as tears welled in his eyes, not from vanity or pride, but from a deeper, quieter disbelief. His voice broke as he confessed, "I was just trying to survive, man. I wasn't trying to save anyone." And Keanu, eyes filled with something close to grace, nodded slowly. "That's exactly why it worked," he said. "Because you weren't trying to be anyone but yourself. You weren't preaching to be heard, you were speaking to heal. And real is what reaches people. Real is what saves." Elijah dropped his gaze, overcome by a flood of feeling he could no longer keep at bay. His hand moved almost instinctively to the cross that rested against his chest, fingers curling around it like a man holding onto a truth he finally believed for himself. The tears came freely now, not loud, not showy, but honest. The kind of tears that only come when something you didn't even know you needed finally arrives. And in that sacred space between them, nothing else mattered. Not the lights. Not the cameras. Not the world outside that would try to reduce this to a viral moment. What lived there between them was too deep for spectacle. It was raw. It was holy. Two men, stripped of pretense, bearing witness to each other's survival. Keanu didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. Because in that silence, something had shifted. Impact had been acknowledged. Purpose had been returned. And survival had become more than just making it through the night. It had become someone else's rescue. Not because Elijah planned it, or earned it, or even asked for it. But because he dared to speak from the middle of his own brokenness, and in doing so, he helped another man find his way out of the dark. Keanu leaned in gently, not with urgency, but with a reverence that slowed time. His voice, though steady, carried a kind of sacred weight, as if the truth he was about to speak wasn't just meant to be heard, it was meant to be held. The room had fallen completely silent, not because someone asked it to, but because everyone instinctively understood they were standing in the middle of something holy. Every camera faded into the background. Every heartbeat seemed to slow. And still, Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He kept his eyes on Elijah, not with praise, not with pity, but with a gratitude so deep it could only come from someone who had once needed saving and found it in a place he never expected. "You thought you were just preaching to a dozen strangers," Keanu said, his voice soft but solid. "But you were reaching a man sitting alone in the dark, a man who wasn't sure he wanted to be here anymore." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They sank straight into the center of the room, where they found their way into every chest, every quiet ache that no one had dared to name. Elijah didn't speak. Not at first. His body moved subtly, almost as if bracing itself for the weight of what had just been laid before him. His lips parted slightly, and his eyes welled not with pride, but with disbelief, with humility, with the raw ache of a man who had spoken so many words into the void and never truly known what came back. He swallowed hard, the corners of his mouth trembling as he tried to form a response. What finally emerged was not a polished reply, but something fragile and true. "I've wanted to quit so many times," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "There are nights I sit alone, wondering if any of this matters. If anyone's even listening." Keanu nodded, not to fill the space, but to honor it. He didn't rush in with comfort. He let the silence hold for a beat longer, then offered something so simple, yet so profound, it felt like a whisper from another world. "Faith," he said, "isn't loud. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't trend. But it saves." And just like that, the truth settled. No applause. No commentary. Just understanding. That was the miracle. Not that Elijah had spoken the perfect sermon. Not that Keanu had heard it at the exact right time. But that in a world obsessed with numbers, noise, and performance, something real had happened quietly. One man, tired and unseen, kept speaking because something in him believed it mattered. And another man, lost and crumbling, stayed alive because of it. It wasn't fame. It wasn't power. It was presence. It was honesty. It was the kind of faith that doesn't need to be decorated to be divine. Elijah sat in a stillness that followed a stillness that felt sacred in its own right. It wasn't the pause between two parts of a show. It was the breath between heaven and earth. His eyes, glassy with tears, turned toward Keanu, though it seemed like he was also looking through him, into some deeper realm where doubt and hope exist side by side. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. He spoke not like a pastor, not like a performer, but like a man asking a question he had never dared to say out loud. "Why me?" he whispered. "Why would God choose someone like me to carry something this heavy?" The question didn't require an answer right away. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't dramatic. It was the cry of every soul who has ever tried to do good while feeling unworthy. Of every person who has carried a light for others while sitting in darkness themselves. Elijah wasn't asking for reassurance. He was searching for truth. And in that moment, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt full of everything that had been said, and everything that couldn't be. Of mystery. Of purpose. Of the quiet, sacred understanding that sometimes, the very people who feel most inadequate are the ones entrusted with the greatest responsibility, not because they're flawless, but because they understand what it means to be broken and still choose to speak anyway. That's what made Elijah the one. Not his perfection, but his willingness to bleed in the open, to whisper hope through the cracks, never knowing who was listening. And somehow, without knowing it, he had helped a man find the strength to live again. Not by trying to save the world, but by telling the truth and letting God handle the rest. His voice was barely more than a breath, but within it lived an entire lifetime of questions, uncertainty, humility, and the aching hope of someone who had given so much of themselves without ever knowing if any of it had truly made a difference. Elijah didn't speak to impress. He spoke because something inside him compelled him to. And now, standing in the light of someone else's survival, he was the one looking for reassurance. Keanu didn't rush to fill the silence. He didn't rehearse his next words or search for the perfect response. He simply stepped forward, steady and grounded, the way only someone who had walked through darkness and come out the other side could. There was no performance in his presence. Only a stillness that came from deep within. He wasn't speaking from a place of theory. He was speaking from experience, the kind that breaks you open, then asks you to keep going anyway. His voice flowed like a river, slow and full of quiet strength. Because the ones who bleed quietly, Keanu said, they're the ones who know how to speak to pain. The words didn't just land, they settled into the space between them, as if they had been waiting for years to be said. The room remained utterly still. Not out of politeness, but reverence. Even the lights overhead dimmed slightly, as if the moment itself deserved less spotlight and more sacred shadow. Time no longer felt like it was moving forward. It had paused to honor the truth being spoken. "You didn't memorize scripture," Keanu continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "You don't wear a collar. You weren't ordained by tradition. But God saw your scars and He handed you a mic anyway." These were not compliments. They were confirmations. Not flattery, but reverence. Because sometimes, the people who limp when they walk are the ones who know best how to walk beside others who are wounded. And those who have survived not for praise, but simply to keep breathing, often end up carrying the greatest healing, not because they asked for it, but because they learned how to give what they never received. Elijah didn't respond. He couldn't. His voice was lost somewhere in the swell of emotion rising inside him. And truthfully, nothing needed to be said. The silence between them spoke volumes. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, rich with meaning. It wasn't empty. It was full of grace, of awe, of something sacred and beyond explanation. It was the kind of moment where even the walls seemed to be listening, where air itself grew still in reverence. Keanu rose slowly, as if careful not to disturb what had just been born between them. His movements were deliberate, each one honoring the weight of the moment. His eyes shimmered, not from weakness, but from clarity, a clarity that comes when something you've held inside for far too long finally finds release. He looked at Elijah with the kind of gaze that sees beyond titles, beyond public personas. He didn't see a pastor or a TV host. He saw a man, one whose unseen faith had helped guide him through a night that almost ended everything. His voice, now filled with a deeper kind of strength, delivered the words he had come there to say. "You weren't just a voice in the dark," Keanu said. "You were the lighthouse." There was no echo in the studio. It didn't need one. That sentence carried its own gravity. It didn't bounce back. It absorbed, and then it transformed. Elijah closed his eyes, not to hold back tears, but to surrender to the enormity of what had just been given to him. He had preached to thousands, poured his heart out into countless messages, but he had never imagined that one of those words would anchor someone on the brink, someone he'd never even known was listening. Keanu didn't wait for applause or affirmation. That wasn't why he was here. He stepped forward and embraced Elijah not as a guest, not as an actor, not as a man known to millions, but as someone who had once stood in the same darkness and now found himself face to face with the man whose light helped lead him home. The embrace was quiet, untheatrical, and full of meaning. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for the soul. No one in the studio moved. No clapping, no cheers. Just stillness. The kind that feels like a held breath, like the entire room understood it was standing in something holy. Even the usual hum of machinery seemed to vanish. Time slowed, and in that silence, the world exhaled. Not in celebration, but in reverence. Because sometimes, healing doesn't come with a spotlight. Sometimes it doesn't need to be loud to be eternal. It just needs to be real. And in that quiet space between two men, one who spoke without knowing, and one who lived because of it, the invisible became visible. Not through spectacle, but through presence. Through truth. Through love that asks for nothing in return. Keanu stood in the stillness that had fallen over the room like a sacred veil, the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be broken, only honored. His eyes were steady, filled not just with emotion but with something eternal, a truth that had lived inside him, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. He turned toward Elijah, his voice low and reverent, not delivering a line, but offering something closer to a blessing. "You don't need a collar to be chosen," he said softly. "You don't need stained glass to carry something holy. And you don't need a pulpit to preach. Sometimes comedy is just the disguise God uses to bring light into places no sermon could ever reach." Elijah didn't move. His eyes brimmed again with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that everything he had once doubted about himself had just been washed away by grace in human form. Keanu stepped closer, and for one final moment, their eyes met, two men who had walked very different paths only to find themselves standing in the same sacred space. "You thought you were just preaching," Keanu said gently. "But you were resurrecting people." The words didn't land with drama. They didn't need to. They sank quietly into the spirit, and the audience knew better than to interrupt what felt divine. No one clapped. No one moved. Even the breath in the room felt slower, as if everyone was waiting for something holy to finish its work. Elijah lowered his head, overwhelmed again, and let the tears fall freely. Keanu reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, not to comfort, but to affirm. Then, in the faintest whisper, almost as if it were a prayer meant for just the two of them, he said, "God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called." And with that final embrace, there was nothing left to prove. Nothing left to perform. Just presence. Just peace. Elijah stood still, as if even his soul needed time to catch up to the gravity of what had just passed between them. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet collision of purpose and grace. For so long, He had spoken into microphones, into cameras, into rooms filled with lights and laughter. But now, here in this sacred hush, he realized this wasn't just another interview. This was something else entirely. Something holy. He turned slowly to the audience, his eyes glossy with emotion, but shining with something deeper than tears, something like recognition. His voice, when it came, was softer than anyone had ever heard it. Not from exhaustion, but from reverence. From awe. "I've preached many sermons in my life," he said, his words catching somewhere between his chest and his throat. "But this might be the holiest moment I've ever known." And the audience didn't clap. They didn't shift in their seats or reach for their phones. They simply stayed still. Still as a sanctuary. Still as a prayer. Because they knew, instinctively, that something real had happened. Elijah lifted his head not in pride, but in surrender. His heart, laid bare. His faith, renewed not through a miracle, but through a man who had once been broken too. "Let's pray," he whispered. No music played. No lights shifted. Just the breath of the room, slowing in quiet agreement. That was all it needed. Keanu stepped back, his presence unchanged, quiet, reverent, steady. The kind of presence that doesn't ask to be noticed but cannot be ignored. He looked at Elijah one last time, not with admiration, but with gratitude. Deep, human gratitude. Then he returned to his seat like someone who had laid something down and didn't need to pick it up again. Elijah remained standing, his hands loose at his sides, his tears untouched. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one carrying the moment. He wasn't hosting. He wasn't leading. He was just a man, seen and held by someone who had once sat in the dark, clinging to the very words he never thought would matter. The cameras kept rolling, but the show was over. What remained was something that couldn't be scripted. Then, almost like waking from a dream, Elijah turned to the audience again. Not to close a segment. Not to deliver a punchline. But to speak from the deepest part of himself. "Maybe," he said, his voice more like a prayer than a statement, "all this time I thought I was just trying to survive. Just trying to get through another day. But maybe I was helping someone else survive too." It wasn't said with certainty. It was said with wonder. And that's what made it powerful. The moment didn't end with a standing ovation. It ended with stillness. With breath. With every person in the room silently asking themselves the same question, have I ever made a difference without knowing it? Because the truth is, we often don't know when our words become lifelines. We don't know who's listening when we speak from our pain. We don't know who we're reaching when we're just trying to stay afloat ourselves. Sometimes, you change a life not by preaching but by surviving out loud. And sometimes, the most important thing you ever do isn't something you plan. It's something you live. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? A time when your story, your honesty, your scars, your faith reached someone without you even realizing it? Maybe it was a word you spoke. A moment you showed up. A time you stayed when leaving would have been easier. If so, we'd love to hear it. Share your story in the comments below. Someone out there may be waiting for a word only you can offer. And if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that your presence matters even when no one says it out loud, then we invite you to become part of this journey. Subscribe to Motivation for Success, a space where we honor the quiet heroes, the unspoken stories, and the faith that doesn't need a spotlight to shine. We believe the most powerful moments are the ones that whisper, not shout. We'll see you in the next video with more stories that heal, inspire, and remind you of something so many people forget. You matter. Not because you're perfect. Not because you're loud. But because you're still here. Still showing up. still shining, even through the cracks. And that, in itself, is a miracle.